Welcome to our Coaches Kitchen Table Discussion Series, where you join myself and the top coaches and influencers in the sport community, where we talk about a variety of topics related to coaching, athlete development, and so on. In this episode, we continue our discussion with UBC National Championship coach and Volleyball Canada's Director of Sports Science, Sports Medicine, and Innovation, Kerry MacDonald. In part one, we discussed Volleyball Canada's development of its gold medal pathway and standardized testing. In part two, Kerry will talk about the injuries and overtraining in volleyball, how standardized testing can be used, and takes questions from coaches. Brad has a question for you.
Hey, go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, Kerry. I'm just wondering how you would go about dealing with the relative age effect. I'm not sure what the data is in our provincial team programs. Like our Team Ontario regional program starts at 14U. I imagine we have a whole bunch of kids selected who are early developers or are born early in the year. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that and how we can avoid becoming like the US soccer situation.
Yeah, one thing I did when I was with the youth national team, and I think everyone can look at is look at birth month. And try and assess like, hey, are we just selecting a whole bunch of January athletes here, and be aware of it? Or if we see that athlete that's like, you know what, I think there's some potential, but they're just a little raw, and you look and like, oh, they're born in December. It's like, yeah, they're 12 months less developed than the other athlete chronologically anyway. So maybe we want to take more of a chance on that raw athlete that's born later, or maybe not a skilled athlete, or maybe is not as physically mature or is physically impressive, the one that's born a little bit later. But I think the biggest thing is know birth month. And when you're making the assessment pieces, just as you're looking at their spike touch numbers or their, passing scores from the tryout or whatever, you're also looking at the birth month, and it's just another variable in the decision-making process.
Cool. Thanks, Brad.
So can I ask a follow-up? I guess for myself, like, I know my own bias would be to lean towards the younger kids who are less physically developed and have more potential, like just trying to balance that whole, like knowing that there's a relative age gap there. And I guess like just how do you take yourself out of it? Like be unbiased in selections. That's the challenging thing, I think.
Yeah, it is. And I think you're right. I think people will bias in some direction or the other. I mean, for sure, we took an athlete on the youth national team I coached with Colin that was a December birth, 6'8" kid that could barely walk and chew gum. And I can tell you that he happens to be going to play college next year after taking a year off after high school, because he had no college offers. And the kid made a youth national team as a 16-year-old. I was wrong. He still can barely walk and chew gum. Coordination never really came for him. So it was a gamble that I took on a kid that was born in December. And I think, it's really tough to do that, but I don't regret the decision. I mean, it could have worked out okay. That kid could have been pretty darn good maybe, but coordination just never really came around.
Not enough yoga classes. I got a question for you though, because I know we're a late specialization sport. We're a late entry sport. So do we have to be careful, because I perceive, well, I mean, you look at the stats of hockey, soccer, and all that. I think the best athletes tend to go into those sports early on, right? So we're not getting necessarily the best athletes overall coming into our sport. So I think what we should be looking at is we're getting the best athlete at the younger age that didn't make that high performance, that team in another sport because they were younger age. We should be sucking them up, because I think we would find a lot more of those athletes that were missed because of their birth date, and we would find that a lot of them could do well in our sport if we identified them. I know I did some way back when the age thing first came out, and I looked at that, and I looked at our rosters, and I said, well, we've got a lot of late birthdays here. To look at that, in our early birthdays, we're probably our least athletic athletes. So I found that interesting. I don't know if I haven't looked at it in years to see if that's changed, but that's sort of my thought process is because we're so late specialized, because kids really don't get into volleyball till 7 and 8, they've either, at that point, they've been left out of hockey, soccer, baseball, basketball at the high competitive level, where we can grab them quickly. So I think as coaches or clubs, they should be paying attention to that type of entry or looking for those types of athletes around for sure. What's your
and
thought on that?
I think it varies a little bit by gender as well.
Right.
I think volleyball is a high priority sport now on our women's side. Its popularity is really, really high. And then we have hotspots in the country where for men, it's also a pretty high popularity sport as well in certain demographics, but for the most part, we're way, way down the list of priorities. So I think there'd be a gender effect there as well. But yeah, I think in all of this, it's just something to be aware of. And as I said, just let's make it a variable in our decision process that we're aware of. And then if you have that data now, look back on your teams and take a look and see, is that happening? Or maybe it's the complete opposite, as you're mentioning. Maybe we are just we're getting all the late developing athletes already because the other sports have picked the other ones off. So be interesting to take a look at that and share the data with me. I'd love to see it.
All right. John Salem has a question for you.
Sorry, talking on mute again. I guess we still have to, I know we want to take in a lot of variables, but when you're dealing in the tryout setting, you're still trying to assess, 60, 80, whatever the number is, athletes in a very short period of time. How can those variables like you're talking, like early December, it's almost impossible to find them unless they happen to have another thing like the kid's 6'2", but can't, do things. You'll still see them over top of everybody. Or we have to get their parents in and see how tall they are. Like there's got to be something else. I don't see how we can do that in a very short tryout session to get some of that data, unless we go to longer tryout periods where we, like Colin says, where we choose the top 30 and then we assess and then choose teams after that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the question, but I agree with you. I think that there's challenges that are there that aren't going to go away. I think assessing physical capabilities is usually a lot easier than assessing technical capabilities, like objectively. I think we can subjectively try and do that. There's some pretty good evidence actually that our subjective assessment of expert coaches is quite strong across a whole range of sports. So we can subjectively watch an athlete perform a skill and be fairly predictive of how they perform that skill in a game from a statistical perspective. So we know we can rely on the coach's eye to do a lot of things and speed up the process. And the same goes true for physiological. We can see a fast athlete and we can tell that one athlete's a lot faster than the other. We can see an athlete that moves really well and seems like, oh, that seems pretty agile. And there's a pretty good evidence that will track as well. So we don't need to throw our coach's eye out the window. It can be a good tool for us to use. And I think that, I remember being back in the start of what is now the rep program. And we assessed, I want to say 88 athletes for a rep program in Calgary. And we were only taking 12. And we had one session of 2 hours to try and do it. And what we did, we took our 6 coaches and every coach subjectively scored every single athlete on anything they saw them do. And just write it down. You saw an athlete perform something, give them a score, and we had a subjective score from 0 to 10. And at the end, we compared everyone's scores. And the hilariousness is we all selected, I think 16 of, or the top 18 were the same between all 5 coaches over a 2-hour practice, even though we did it independently. So there are ways to do it. No way is going to be perfect. But I think one thing that can help that process, I think we can rely on our coach's eye.
Good, thanks. I think one of those things that just come up, I think we should have a session, and I will put this out there, is another session would be on just tryout. How to run a tryout that's the most efficient and try to get that. Who do you think, Kerry, it would be a good person that would be able to come up with a good tryout plan, or at least give us good information on helping clubs design quality tryouts or assessment evaluation of athletes in a short period of time?
You know what, I have a couple of thoughts on it. One is I actually think our provincial bodies are doing a decent job at at developing this, like the work that Ontario and LP have done in conjunction with BC, Saskatchewan, and Alberta on like an athlete framework, skill assessment framework. I think they've done quite a decent job at doing this. So I would look at the process that they're using now for assessing skills in athletes. And they're going to like an app-based process and really streamlining that assessment process. So those involved with the TMO program, I'm sure you're well aware of it. That's one of the better ones that I've seen in Canada. Yeah, I'm trying to think who else I've heard talk on this topic and do a good job.
Is there an expert out there that does? Is there like an expert out there that's their forte?
Honestly,
I haven't heard of anybody. Yeah, I haven't heard of anybody, but
not that I'm aware of. No. Yeah.
Selection process.
Yeah.
There you go. There's a task for somebody out there. Job for someone. Cool. Does anybody else have any more questions about assessment and evaluation?
Brenda does. Go ahead, Brenda.
I wanted to ask you for your insight on the whole assessment from a tryout perspective. In the context of a tryout window, the PSO is, I'm on a committee where we're revising or reviewing the tryout window. And there seems to be this big desire to keep it really, really streamlined, like a weekend, a week, and a weekend. So, a stretch of 10 days, and you've got to make, basically life and death decisions on kids. And in many cases, kids are trying out for more than one club in that 10 days. They might have 4 days in a row on court after having none. And then you make some choices, and then you find out one of the kids is going to another club, and it's just a chaos. And I've always felt that, why are we in a hurry? Why can't we do this, over a longer period of time? And there's a lot of coaches that, I just want to pick them and get on with it. And I think we have some pretty special kids fall through the cracks in the name of speed. And I just wondered what you think should happen in that context. Should it be a 10-day thing? Should it be a month? What do you just, sort of your personal opinion based on your expertise?
Sorry. Thanks, Brenda. That's a really good question. I think it's a really tough process, and I've listened in a little bit just over the years, specifically in Alberta, and how they've tried to tackle this. So I'm a little bit aware of how they've done it. I've been out of the club system for a while, so I'm not the most up to speed, but obviously we're going to make a better decision with the more information that we have. Rushing anything from a selection process, I don't see that being the best process of going through. I think it's a tough situation though, because it's also a really high stress environment for the athletes. And my fear with stretching it out is honestly more the psychological impact of them going tryout to tryout and being on pins and needles and not knowing. But the more information we have over a longer period of time, the better. I remember, and I know this is fantasy land, but I remember a while back pitching the idea, and I was in Calgary at the time, and I said, for boys tryouts, why don't we just have one tryout for the city? Can we just have like boys tryouts in the city, and we're just it's all the clubs are gonna come in, and all the clubs are gonna watch, and we're just gonna make teams, and we're just gonna play, and then at the end you're gonna pick athletes, and it's like sending out offers, and then athletes get to choose or not, and I'm like, and then we get all the testing done, and I'm like, because it's same idea. We had athletes. I remember athletes would come running into tryouts, and they'd have another number painted on their calf from the tryout they just came from, and I'm like, I don't think you should be trying out right now. I think you should be eating dinner. So yeah, I think the whole process is really tough, and I'm sure my idea has tons of flaws and why it can't work.
Well, you're suggesting that adults could work together. That's the hardest part of that. That was the same idea I had, Kerry, here in Ottawa, and I always thought it would be a great idea. It empowers the athlete versus empowering the club, and it makes it so much easier for that athlete if they were just in a huge environment where they were going to be schmoozed versus them trying to schmooze us by showing up and, like you said, stressing it out. And again, but as Brenda said, it's we have to take the adults out of amateur sport to get the right thing done. So until the egos can be checked at the door, it's going to be a tough sell. The other part of the tryout process that I think is flawed is the idea that all ages try out at the same time, both genders, all ages. So everybody's like really stressed for gym time. So the quantity of hours that you actually look at a given kid is pretty compressed because you got another team coming in on their tail. And I've often thought that maybe we should be doing the 18s, you know, and then some 17s can try out for that. And if they don't make it, then the 17s is next. And, you know, you kind of waterfall it down. And yeah, we just don't seem to have the time. Everybody wants to get it done really quickly. And the earlier, the better. You know, they'd be happier if we were in August or even the week after nationals for the next season. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I think we could like it used to be in Alberta that 14U tryouts weren't allowed to happen until the new year, and then 16 or 15 and above could happen starting beginning of December or whatever. So they were split that way. The youngest age group started up in January, and it felt like it was so easy for them. They had, you know, it wasn't that big of a challenge. They had lots of time, and so I think there's definitely some merit to making sure that you have enough court space and resources allocated to do a thorough and get, again, capture as much data, make as much of it as informed decision as possible.
It's a great topic. So I'll put something together and see if we can have a discussion on that, because I think it's a relevant topic. The only thing I would add is I do like the idea, if we're trying to promote multi-sport athletes, we want to try to, if you could select your team, and I'm sure there's a lot, like Kerry said, flaws in this, but if you could select your team in June and then let your team go off and do multi-sport, and they could do some, you know, do some of the other, you could do some basic training stuff, but outside of their whatever other competitive soccer, lacrosse, whatever they're doing. And then you don't have to necessarily get back and stressed out in September when school is starting and all that. You can let them finish off their summer season, have that break in September, get into school, their academics, let them focus on that, and then start your preseason training in October. I wonder if that option would be something that would be beneficial to the athletes, especially at the higher ages, like 18, 16, maybe 16 for girls, a bit different, but 17, 18U for girls and boys. Other than me selling my trying to poach a player from another club, there's not a lot of change in teams at that age group. So I wonder if that would be and everyone's fresh coming off the same training experiences. So they've all had the training same level. So some haven't gone to camp, some weren't at a national team program or a provincial team program, whereas the others had to work for the summer to afford to be able to pay for club. So they don't have those reps coming into that tryout. It's sort of a more even playing field for all the athletes trying out. I don't know if that would, I'm sure there's a lot of issues with that, but to me, that would always made a little bit more sense. But you have to worry about that coach that says, oh, you're on my team. Now we're starting to train June 22nd and you can't do anything else. I mean, there have to be strict guidelines on that, but it would be interesting. I wonder about that sometimes.
I'm glad it's not my job to figure that out.
Sure it is, with science behind it. All right, let's move into our big topic, the last one, the one that no matter what level of your coaching is a big concern in terms of how you approach your training sessions, your seasonal planning, and your concern for your athlete overall. Let's talk about injuries. Specific to volleyball, overuse injuries and then the overtraining injuries are two components I'm always concerned about. In Ontario, we mix our high school season with on the female side, we mix our high school season with our club season. At the junior level, so grade 9 and 10 volleyball in Ottawa, we actually have our junior high school season during March, April, which is our high competitive phase, our championship phase for a club. So there's a lot of issues I see over time. What are some, I guess, first of all, Kerry, can you sort of give us what are the stats telling us about overuse injuries? Where are they coming? Why are they occurring? And then talk about overtraining as well, and sort of the same nature as how do we identify those types of things and how do we prevent them?
Sure, yeah. I guess as a precursor to this, I'll just mention that in the coming weeks, you're going to see an email come out from Volleyball Canada. It's going to come to all. It's actually probably going to go first to all the registered members of that would have been at nationals this year in across the country. And it's a survey. It's actually a 1-year retrospective survey for athletes to complete on injuries in this past year. We've done this every year with the, I guess every year with the except we didn't get 2019, but we have 2016, 2017, 2018. Now we're looking at 2020 data. And trying to capture and get an understanding of the injuries that are happening in Canada within club volleyball. So often this email ends up landing on a volleyball club administrator's or a coach's desk, and it doesn't actually get to the athletes. So just as a precursor for those listening, please pass it on and share that information, because it's been really, really valuable for us to have this information in making these decisions. So what I can tell you is that the most common injury we have in our sport that gets reported as an injury and it's easily identifiable is still ankle sprains. So ankle sprains is still going to constitute the vast majority of injuries that we have in our sport. That said, outside of ankle sprains, our next most common one are knees and shoulders in our adolescent population. And those are our overuse chronic issues. So as much as ACL injuries are terrible from a burden perspective, their relative incidence rates are quite low compared to our chronic issues. So shoulder and knee being the most common. And then as we go up in age, and more in men than in women, as we start to see the back issues arise. So primarily low back problems. So those constitute kind of the three big ones. The research will tell us that we're probably in the neighborhood of, at the highest level, at the national team level, we're about 85% of athletes are dealing with some form of chronic injury at any given time. So only 15% aren't dealing with a chronic injury at some reported time. And that's the data that we have from FIVB. So we know chronic issues is really our bigger concern. Ankle sprains, although I said they're really, really common, they don't have it doesn't take a lot to recover from an ankle sprain. And maybe just the one thing I will mention on ankle sprains is that if we actually just properly rehab the first sprain, we would reduce ankle sprains by up to 8-fold. So the vast majority, the most common, or the highest risk factor, I should say, for an ankle sprain is having previously sprained that same ankle. The minute you've sprained an ankle, you're 4 times more likely to resprain it than the initial sprain itself. So if we just properly rehab ankle sprains, we can really do a lot to reduce their severity as well as their frequency. So that's just a couple things just to get the ankles out of the way. And then on the chronic side, as I mentioned, those are our primary issues. And when it comes to any sort of chronic injury, the biggest issue that we have is, well, there's two, but one of the key ones is that most chronic injuries occur and are really, their first incidences arise early in season. So it's when we have dramatic changes in training volume. So if we think of our situation even now coming out of COVID, and I just gave a little talk on this to some NCAA coaches, is that if you go from sitting on the couch to running a marathon, you know you're going to injure yourself. And you have to start by going for a jog around for me, maybe around the block might be day one. But you have to eventually progressively increase to your marathon. And for the most part in sport, we're really, really bad at this. So we get the athletes either coming off the summer, and I'm sure in a lot of situations we know that in school volleyball, we know that even with club volleyball, is they come to us after Christmas, for example, they just had Christmas off. And that's where we see the greatest prevalence of overuse problems in any of the research that we've done. And we see the same thing with the national team. Most of our overuse problems are greatest when they first start up with us in beginning of May, assuming that they've had somewhat of an off season. But that's not even always that common. In youth sports athletes, the greatest prevalence is in September and December. So right after coming off the summer and off of Christmas. So, and in club volleyball, it follows similar suits. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces, is understanding that that's when we're going to probably create an overuse problem where one didn't previously exist, and or we're going to inflame an issue that has previously occurred. So as coaches, we have to think of how do we get up to marathon speed? And I think if there's one thing that I would say to try and prevent overuse problems, it's just that. We have to be progressive in our increase of volume, of training volume and intensity, right? We have to progressively overload that over time. And tendons, which is really what's being aggravated with our knees and our shoulders, they just take a long time to adapt. They need 6-7 weeks to make major adaptations. So we need to think about that and realize that, an athlete that hasn't done any jumping at all, if they come into practice and they jump 100 times, their knees are probably going to hurt the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. And then usually what happens is, one of the pieces specifically with patellar tendinopathy is once you warm up, the pain kind of goes away a little bit. And then, so that athletes can also self-manage with things like ibuprofen and Tylenol and Advil. And so they can mask symptoms. So it's something that they can deal with for a very, very long time, but usually they're just progressively making the problem worse as they go. So if there's one key piece for coaches, I would say to start off with is recognizing how are we increasing the training volume. When we first start training, or even within the season, if maybe we start really slow and we build up, that's great. Then we can kind of try and maintain and ride that. And we just have undulations in our training volume based on our competition calendar. I don't know. The other piece I'll just mention is I think one of the inherent problems that we have, or challenges that we are faced within a club volleyball environment, is that we have, I'm going to generally say that we have 3 practices a week for about 2 hours. And then we go into a tournament on a weekend where we might have the equivalent of 3 practices within a day. And the reality is that what we have done to prepare the athlete for that day is insufficient. So we can't play the same athlete every single point for 3 matches in a day and expect that the fact that they had, 3 days of training that week was enough to get them there, because there just isn't enough recovery time within that day. So we have to think about bench management and think about how we're managing our athletes, their volumes within a tournament format, because the reality is that our training environment, I would say, for the most part, does not adequately prepare athletes for a tournament environment.
Gotta write that down.
I can stop there as I'm starting to feel like I'm on a soapbox. So.
Yeah. Prepares.
Kerry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if our training at the club level isn't preparing us for tournament play properly, would you suggest altering our training to more reflect what a tournament looks like, or would you suggest altering our play to be more like once a day competitions?
I think it depends on context is really important here. I think in most context, altering our training is not feasible. So training 5 days a week is probably not feasible. Training for 3 hours is probably not feasible. And really at the end of the day, I mean, the tournament format that we're going into is a unique one-off that you only see in adolescent sport. The minute that athlete turns 19, the odds of them playing more than 2 matches in a day becomes very, very low. So I would say that for the most part, I think our tournament environment either needs to alter, or even better yet, in my opinion, is we just need to manage our tournaments better. And I see that the top teams do not rest, or not even the top teams, most teams do not rest their top athletes sufficiently enough. And there's some really good evidence coming out there that the athletes that are the greatest risk of chronic injury and career-ending injury due to chronic issues is actually our best athletes. So we need to really there's a great paper that was written by one of my co-supervisors, Dr. Roald Barr, and it's called Demise of the Fittest. And basically what that paper is getting at is that we're destroying our biggest talents in sport because we do not give them the days off. We do not give them the rest. And those same athletes that are your best volleyball player are probably also the best basketball player on their school team or the best soccer player on their community team or whatever else. And so they don't get the rest anywhere and no one's giving them that time off. And those are the athletes that we need to be really cautious with. And that's a tough thing to do, because usually that attacks the team's odds of winning a match, and therefore attacks the ego of the coach. And that's a tough one to play with.
Yeah, I mean, even in practice, right? I mean, when you show up in practice, you need your best player practicing, but if they've just come off a basketball game, in theory, you don't want them to, but then your practice environment changes when your best athlete isn't there. And, the perception of the coach could be, well, wait, if I don't make my best player practice, while the other guys will say, well, why should I practice if they don't have to practice? And I think we create that mental barrier for us to do what's right a lot of times, or what we know is right to do. And, rest, it's better doing nothing sometimes. It produces more than trying to do too much. So I think it's that communication piece I think we have to do to coaches to get them to understand that. And then within the coach, their team itself, is that communication between coach and athlete saying, hey, you're better to me when you're fresh and healthy, so I need to know when you're not. It's not a detriment to you that you don't practice today, or you only practice stuff on the ground. That's not going to put you on the bench at the next tournament. It's just simply going to be, you're going to be fresher at the next tournament. And I think that communication link and that not even selling job, but that trust factor between player and coach is an important factor to develop in order to accomplish that goal.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we've employed at the national team, and I brought over from UBC, is we do a daily pain score assessment of every single athlete. So at the start of every single practice and or every single game, we ask all the athletes for their pain we have a 0 to 10 scale that we use, and we record it. And we write it down. And the purpose of that is to try and get some sort of a snapshot of how that athlete is doing from a pain perspective. Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, if we have 85% of our athletes are dealing with something, it can't be if you report any pain, you don't play. We won't be able to feel the team. So what we have to do instead is recognize, okay, what is a level of pain that's acceptable? And are we able to manage and get this pain trending in a direction that we're happy with? And then when is it into a situation where it's really a problem and we need to, have some more significant adaptations or interventions have to occur. So the assessment using a daily pain score, I think, is something that can be a real valuable component.
I was just going to mention at Queen's with our IST, we did something like that, but a little more integrated. So it was like a wellness survey that include injuries, but also, how stressed are you academically, lack of sleep, and all those kinds of things. Did you get to eat before the workout or before practice and so on? So they kind of look at a more global aspect to maybe tailor a workout down or reduce your reps because of, you're kind of getting to the end of your rope kind of thing.
Yeah, like an overall wellness assessment, I think is fantastic. We have that as well. So we're getting an understanding of the athlete's overall wellness. And a really good standard one is what's called the Hooper-McKinnon, if anyone's looking for something in this space. So the Hooper-McKinnon Wellness Questionnaire is a fairly standardized one that's used, I would say, I'm going to guess 90% of professional and national teams around the world are using something like that on a daily basis, or some sort of modified version of a Hooper-McKinnon. So it's a really common one. Yeah.
I used the athlete monitoring app this year with both the Ottawa U guys and with the girls 18U team. The girls were much better at completing it than the boys. But entry into practice, you get your results. And so entry into practice was you have to have completed the app first before you get in. So I found that useful. I again, comes back to the coach using that information. And I think that was probably where I would say the weakest part was I didn't effectively use the information on a regular basis to have those conversations with the athletes. But that would be on me to fix that. But I found it useful. I thought the athletes found it useful to be able to communicate. And the other big one that I found was useful was when they would go to physio or physiotherapy, especially with acute injuries and stuff, they would type in what the physiotherapist would say and what their prognosis was, what they should be doing. And the physiotherapist at times would type it in as well. And that communication was huge difference for me, I thought, this year in terms of understanding the injury. Because when you ask the athlete to come back and say, okay, well, what did they say? And they give you, I hurt my back. Well, okay, but what does that mean? Where are you at type thing? And I think that type of information was very useful. And I found I used that quite a bit. So I was happy with that side of it for sure, especially with concussions. That helped because they would see a doctor, the concussion protocols, it was there and they were able to put stuff in. And then also just the concussion baseline testing, they had that in the app as well. So they would do that previously as well. So that I would be able to monitor that as well. So that was helpful. So technology is allowing us to do a lot of these things now that we couldn't do when we were our younger coaches. Well, not you, but Brenda and I.
I'm getting up there.
Any other questions with injuries in terms of chronic injuries? Yeah, go ahead, Brett.
I think this is veering a little bit away from chronic injuries. I listened to your presentation, I think you did for Volleyball Alberta, on acute chronic workload and managing that in a seasonal plan. And I started thinking about, for university athletes, the mental stresses that they have at certain times in the year. And I was wondering if you had any insights into how does the mental fatigue tie into potential chronic or potential acute injuries, and how do we go through the process of preparing a good YTP that will help us manage that and tie that in?
It's a really, really good question, Brad. It definitely plays a factor. Having done some coaching at the university level and seeing how athletes are doing during their exam periods, what we've found is primarily it's often, well, at the university, we found a lot of athletes had increase in lower back issues. They spend a lot more time sitting at desks and actually studying as opposed to pretending to be studying and lounging on their phones. So low back issues, we actually saw flare up, and it was really related to both midterms and final exams at the university level. So I think it's a factor. One thing that I adapted to is in year 2, I actually inputted every single one of our guys' exams and their exam schedule into our YTP. So I had an understanding of both frequency, so how many athletes they had a midterm that week or a final exam that week. And it was twofold. One was to understand the psychological fatigue and stress that might be on them, but then also to recognize that they're probably not going to be sleeping as well, no matter what they report to me. And maybe that's not the week that we want to really be trying to hammer home something complex tactically. Maybe we want to even lighten our game plan for our opponent that weekend, and we're going to try and simplify things down and keep it a little bit simpler. And maybe we're going to even decrease our volume and intensity on court that week. So trying to adapt what we're doing in our sporting context to take into account the realities of their situation. So those are a couple of things we played with, and I don't know if they worked or not, but
nice.
But I think it's a really astute observation, and it's something we've seen with. I was doing some work with the swim team at UBC, and they're interesting because they log every single practice, and they know exactly how far everybody swam, and they know exactly how far, what the splits were and everything else. And what they found was that every single athlete, essentially, if they had more than 2 midterms within a week, they could almost predict like a 10% drop in performance. And it was just, you could literally just tie it into their academic schedule. So they've seen that as well in that sport, and being able to monitor it and see it a lot better than I have. And then the other one that they saw was that the rating of perceived exertion that they collect, which is essentially how hard was that practice, rating of perceived exertion goes up with the exact same practice, just because of the fact that they had exams going on at the same time. So, yeah.
I know at the high school level, it's the same thing. We definitely see don't try to teach anything new during exam time, because you're repeating it 2 weeks later anyways. So it's a matter of just, okay, let's have fun. Maybe look at, how do we incorporate some physical literacy stuff, right? And some fun things outside the box, keep it fresh, keep it light, because you're not gaining anything by, you're just repeating everything you're going to try to teach them anyway. So you might as well just do it for fun and let the stress of exam time get over. The other issue we have at high school is, especially at the 18U level, 17 and 18U level, is recruiting is one. So that's stress of getting signed, and then stress of going to university, applying for university and waiting for your acceptance. Those things come out too, and you can see the athletes that have early confirmation of where they're going. Their smiles on their faces and their jump in their step is a lot different than those that don't have acceptance to a university or don't have a program to play at yet. And that's a big dynamic that coaches have to deal with at the 17 and 18U level for sure. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, Brad, I was just going to add, from my experience, my few years of post-secondary, I found pretty good success by, I didn't want to, there's something to be said for maintaining a certain load, because if you have big highs and then nothing and highs and nothing, I think you're more likely to get injured. And Kerry, you can confirm that or not, but some consistency in the training load. But I would tend to, on purpose, make it more fun, more competitive, add some music, make it a little bit less sort of demanding perfection based, still some volume, but I did find that the athletes responded and practice was more productive in that context. At the heart of, it's a bit tapering too, but not quite as dramatically as giving them a day off.
Agree, for sure. So that sort of leads you into the next topic, though, Kerry, was overtraining and how we're dealing with that. I know you brought up the perceived exertion question. I think that you can talk more about that and the implementation of that.
Yeah, I mean, one way we can assess, it's really one of the hardest things to do in sport without real sophisticated measures, and even sophisticated measures can be tricked, is to understand when an athlete is in a state of overtraining. One of the big terminologies that has really emerged in sport and sports science is what's called relative energy deficiency syndrome, or REDS. And it's essentially a syndrome that comes to be based on an athlete being in a state of overreaching or training basically above what their system can handle for sustained periods of time. And it's a very complex syndrome in that athletes don't often know that they're in that state, and they can stay in that state for a very, very long time. But what we know is that when they're in that state, they have a really hard time developing muscle mass. We know their reaction time is impacted, bone health is impacted. So there's a lot of real long-term and short-term negative consequences of being in a state of REDS. We don't even know the proportion of REDS within a youth population or an adolescent population. We really don't even know it much outside of individual sports at an elite level that have started to look at this. We did some stuff with our men's national team last year, and I can tell you that 80% of our athletes had some marker of REDS within our men's national team program. So there's some definite considerations that we need to be aware of. And it is a tough thing to try and identify, however. But one of the key ones is, and that's often utilized, is looking at something like a rating of perceived exertion. So if you know that week over week a practice is a fairly similar structure, but yet you are asking athletes at the end, what is their RP for that session, and you're seeing variable swings in that, or it seems to be getting a lot harder for a practice that seemed to be a little bit easier, that can be some metric that can potentially be used, but it's not a really clean one, but it is something that can potentially happen. So it's a tough piece to get at. One of the other ones is willingness to train. At the end of the day, sports should be fun. And often when athletes get into these states, it can have some real have REDS or just overtraining in general, is there can be some real psychological consequences. And one of it is they just don't want to keep going to practice anymore. And they just don't have that real drive and that desire. So just having an understanding of an athlete's willingness to train can be somewhat of a simple subjective assessment process that can be looked at. But again, I'm by no means an expert in this space. I'm very fortunate I get to work with people that are way more experts in this, and I'm fortunate that I get to work with things like blood samples and to try and identify biomarkers and do DEXA bone scans and look at bone mineral density health and to try and assess whether or not our athletes are in states of REDS. But even something as simple as if you have an athlete with a stress fracture, it's not a bad idea to take as an assessment and really pull back and be like, is that an athlete that was maybe overtraining? You know, are they an athlete that are on the school basketball team and the dance team and the volleyball team and whatever else? And it's like, is there just a lot going on? And maybe that athlete was training above their tolerance. And there's another piece I'll say that we've focused heavily on with this is actually just energy availability based on how much calories do they take in. So a fairly simple assessment is to try and just look at like how many calories are they consuming in a day from a caloric intake versus how many are they burning, how many are going out the other end. And if you get into a situation where it's just chronic under fueling, that's a really good, that's the preeminence or the precursors to being in a state of REDS and being in a state of overtraining. So we need to make sure that those, you know, the body's a really resilient being, and we can take a lot on, but we need to make sure that we are properly fueling it to handle the demands that we're going to ask it to do.
Does sleep quality come into play there as well?
Yeah, it can be. Some people's sleep can really be impacted by it. We know that and it can go in two ways. So some people can be in like oversleeping situations where they're constantly sleeping 10, 11 hours. So that can be a factor in it. And then other people can have a lot of sleep restlessness and can be getting 5-6 hours on a regular basis. So so proper sleep hygiene is something that we definitely want to try and look at to try and counteract overtraining and making sure that we are sleeping enough. So if you have athletes that are I'm sleeping 12 hours a night, coach, it's like, wow, that body's needing a lot of recovery. It might be doing a little more than it can actually handle. So there might be a little bit too much going on. So yeah, but it's something that it's out there. I think we're just learning a lot more about it. One of the key pieces actually in Canada that we need to be aware of is just vitamin D levels. Like we don't get enough natural sunlight. We're also, most people I assume are indoor volleyball coaches here. So we're indoors through most of our winter months or during our season. So vitamin D supplementation is something that I think a lot of Canadians should look at. Most doctors would probably recommend that we should be taking vitamin D, especially during the winter months. So another thing to consider, that's one thing that we did that assessment as well with our national team and found that those that weren't already on a supplement were almost all deficient in vitamin D. And vitamin D has a bunch of different pieces, but one of them is actually bone health is a component that it plays a factor in. So as well as mood and psychological state. So another one to be considered.
Right. Is there any simple tests or activity that we could do to simply test that as well? I know like Dave Preston used to use, or maybe still does, is the vertical test after tournaments. And if you're not making your baseline, then it's a saw indication as well. Chris Schwartz has talked about using just grip strength as an indicator.
Yeah, and I would actually say both are possible ones. I don't know as much about grip. Like grip strength could definitely possibly work. The vertical jump one can possibly work. I think both of them are probably going to catch real extremes of fatigue, but may not capture the more subtle fatigue states. So I think both are definitely possible ones. Reaction time is going to be one of the first things to go because our neuromuscular system is going to be impacted before first. Our ability to react and quick reactions is something that's going to be impacted first. So force plates is something that's looked at often right now with fatigue and looking at our rate of force development. Similar to what I talked about earlier, athletes can maybe still jump as high. So on Dave's test, they might still be able to touch the same spike touch, but just their mechanics are going to change. They wouldn't be quite as, the amount of time, the force curve would be longer, but the maximal arc on the curve would still be the same. So yeah, it can be a challenging piece to try and capture in a measurement or an assessment piece. So I think psychological aspects are something to really be considered of. I think caloric intake aspects are another one to be considered. And educating both parents and athletes on these pieces, I think, is an important steps that we can look at trying to take.
Developing the trust factor, right, between coach and athlete so that they don't feel they're being punished when they say they're fatigued.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a valuable piece.
Cool. All right. Does anybody have any questions, follow-up questions with Kerry? TikTok.
I can't believe everyone stuck around for that long to hear me ramble. That's impressive. Congratulate yourselves.
Oh, it's been so informative, Kerry. We appreciate it. And I think we've got a good perspective of the importance of science in sport and coaching. And we've got some good ideas of what we could use, take back to our teams. Those university coaches have obviously a bigger budget and a lot more opportunities to use more technology. But I think as club coaches, there's lots of things we can do to help our athletes, get to the pinnacle of whatever their potential is, with a lot of suggestions you provided today that we can use right away. You've also created us a new topic of tryouts, and how do we do a tryout the most efficient, not the most efficient way, the best way possible to get as many quality athletes without looking for them, or without them falling through the cracks. So I appreciate that as well. I will send out the resources that Kerry showed, that he said we can show with everybody. So it'll be, number one will be physical testing standards, trying to get that across the country the same with everybody, so that we can also use the same standards going forward, so that when we see Volleyball Canada or we see provincial team jump testing, we know what that means and how they did it, so that our athletes can try to strive towards them. And then the gold medal pathway assessments, Kerry, you've also agreed to let us check those out. So we'll send those out so you can take a deeper dive into them. And the idea that you guys are trying to produce more club level stuff like that, when that comes out, we'll all be looking forward to looking at that as well. So really appreciate all your time. Anyone else have any more comments or questions? Brenda, you got one? Go ahead.
Yeah, this is silly, but is the training in Gatineau that's going on, is it closed because of COVID?
It is closed, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. The venue, the facility itself is actually closed except for us. We're the only users that are allowed to be in there right now.
Makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Good.
We do have a multiple camera system with a stream. I'm sure if you talk to Lionel, he might be able to send you a link. You might be able to watch practice remotely, but but no one can be in. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Just a reminder, next week we've got Kyle Paquette coming out, who is Volleyball Canada's sports psychologist. He also is sports psychologist for many other Olympic teams and individuals as well. I've worked with him the last year and a half, and also previously with the Mavericks, because he was helping initiate one of their first mental training programs club-wide. And I also work with his wife, so I have a connection with him to get him on. So that's why he's available for us at this time. So hopefully we'll get you all out. We'll follow up with our gold medal standard or pathway with Kyle on the mental side of it, and try to get into emotional, social emotional learning as well, and how we can help our athletes on that side of it. Again, Kerry, thank you very much for taking your time away from your children. We really appreciate it. It's been really worthwhile. For everyone that's online, this will get posted on Facebook, or is being live on Facebook now, but it'll stay up there, so you can send your coaching friends to it to check it out. Same with the original one. And it'll end up on YouTube as well, so that we can keep spreading the word and keep everyone going forward in terms of helping our athletes reach their full potential. So thanks again, everyone. Enjoy your week, and we will check in next Monday. Oh, Brad, you want to?
Colin, I have another question for Kerry that's totally unrelated to any of the stuff that we've talked about.
Sure.
Do you mind if I ask?
Kerry. You got 10 minutes.
Kerry, is that cool?
Record, so.
We're good. Go ahead.
Amazing. So this is more of like a personal question. I guess like for coaches in Canada, type of recommendations would you have in terms of additional learning as we continue to coach in Canada, like going through the NCCP stuff and going through like the performance coach process, and then looking into the advanced coaching diploma. Any recommendations from yourself on how to continue to grow and develop as a coach? Is advanced coaching diploma a good way to go? Is a master's a good way to go? pursuing a PhD at some point. Kind of know your path.
Don't do a PhD. That's just horrible torture. Yeah, I would say, I mean, the NCCP system is good and it's only getting better, in my opinion. I think there's lots of improvements happening there. The advanced coaching diploma or a master's program, I think there's a lot of really good ones in Canada. I teach, I should say, within the UBC one right now, but I did the UVic one, and there's others that are out there and international ones that are good as well. But I think the one piece that I've learned is there's just no replication for having other mentor coaches that you can work with and being able to go into other people's gyms. No formal education can really replace that. So if there's the most important piece that I have learned is that, being in other coaches' gyms, seeing them coach in their environment, seeing the challenges that they're facing on the day-to-day basis, then having someone that you can then go back to and be like, hey, I'm really struggling with this, or a team's struggling with that. How should I handle this? So setting up like a formal mentorship plan or process with some coaches. And I think just the one thing you realize is I've never been turned out of a gym. Any gym I've ever asked to walk into, I've been allowed to enter into it. And I think our sport is really awesome that way. And I spent a lot of time in Ben Josephson gym when I was coaching at UBC, direct competitors. But I've learned a ton from him. And as an example. So I think that's very common across our country. And I don't know too many coaches that will turn you away. Or even the idea of if you I've done some work. I teach some classes on this around setting up like a formal mentorship plan. So what areas do you want to get better at? Actively going out and finding who are people that are really good in this area, approaching them with like, hey, I really want you to be a mentor for me in my coaching development. And it's because I want to get better at this area. I know you're really good in this area. And if you approach anyone with a real clear understanding of, hey, I want to get better in this area. Would you be willing to help me? I think you're going to find that there's very few coaches that would say no to that. There's a lot that would want to try and help. And just the clearer the understanding and the expectations are, the more likely they are to probably say yes. So those would be the big ones for me. But as I say that, I think the foundational understanding of formal education is a valuable one. I don't think you need a PhD unless you got some burning desire for pain. But it's PhDs awesome. Are good. PhDs are good if you got a burning question. If you have one question you really want to hammer into and there's a good situation, there's just a lot of things, in my opinion, that need to align to make a PhD make sense. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Hope that helps.
Definitely.
Cheers.
Okay. Thanks everyone, and thanks Colin for having me. And my email's on the website, or it's kmacdonald@volleyball.ca. I'm happy to answer questions, and we'll get back to emails or what have you. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we'll keep trying to.
We'll get you back on and do mentoring. Teach us how to be a mentor, how to get a mentoring coach and set us up.
Yeah, absolutely happy to talk about that as well.
Awesome. All right, thanks everybody.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
This is the end of another Coach's Kitchen Table Discussion Series. We would like to thank our very special guest, Kerry MacDonald. We'd also like to thank all of you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss an episode. Leave a comment on topics you would like to get more information about.